Hey, second graders, I kind of left you on a cliffhanger with chapter 21, but here we go for 22. Jane Smith. Now we'll find out about this lady. I found Jane Smith, Jason told Stephen the next morning when he got to school. You better tell Dee Dee, said Stephen. They hurried across the playground. A whistle blew. No running, ordered Mr. Lewis, the professional playground supervisor. Now I want both of you to go back to the edge of the blacktop and walk this time. The boys went back the way they came, then came back the way they went. Dee Dee was sitting on a bench. She had been benched by Mr. Lewis for excessive noise-making. I found Jane Smith, Jason whispered as he walked past her. Dee Dee and Jason entered the classroom together. Mrs. Drizzle was seated behind her desk. As they passed in front of her, Dee Dee stopped and said, Did you have a nice time at the dentist yesterday, Jason? Yes, Dee Dee, said Jason. It was a very nice time. I wonder if we have the same dentist, said Dee Dee. What's your dentist's name? Her name is Dr. Payne, said Jason, but that hasn't always been her name. It hasn't? Asked Dee Dee. Oh, no, said Jason. Before she was married, her name was Jane Smith. Jane Smith? Asked Dee Dee. Is that spelled Janesmith? Yes, that's how you spell Jane Smith, said Jason. But like I said, that's not her name anymore. Her name is Dr. Payne. She works at the dentist office on 124 Garden Street. They took their seats. Do you know what they were trying to do? Clever kids. Late that afternoon, Dr. Payne finished work and walked out of her office. It had been a good day. She had drilled 25 teeth. She made $60 for every tooth she drilled. 25 times $60 is $1,500. Not bad for a day's work. Of course, not all the teeth really had cavities, but how would any of her patients find out? She got into her fancy silver and black sports car and drove away. She sang along with the radio. She didn't even notice the old beat-up green station wagon in her rearview mirror. She lived in a mansion next to the lake. There was a stone wall around the house. She pressed a button in her car, and an iron gate opened. The gate closed behind her as she headed up the long and winding driveway. A moment later, the old green station wagon stopped and parked next to the gate. A woman got out, walked around the back, and opened the tailgate. She pulled out a ladder. She set the ladder up against the wall. Under her arm, she carried an old blue notebook. Have any ideas who that is? Dr. Payne's butler handed her a drink. The cook was making dinner. Dr. Payne's dog, cat, and husband were waiting for her in the den. Her dog's name was Brussels, and her cat's name was Sprouts. She petted them both. Her husband's name was Sham. She petted him too. Hi, darling, how was your day? He asked. I made $1,500, said Jane. They hugged and kissed. They loved each other, but they loved money even more. Then they had dinner by candlelight as they watched the sun set over the lake. After dinner, they sat out on the deck under the stars. Sprout lay purring on Jane's lap. Brussels sat faithfully by her side. Life was perfect. I love you, darling, she said, petting Sprouts. And I love you, said Sham. I was talking to the cat, said Jane. The butler stepped out onto the deck. Excuse me, madam, he said, but there's an elderly woman out in the yard. Jane's long fingernails dug into her cat's neck. I wonder how she got past the gate, said Sham. I don't know, sir, said the butler. She's probably hungry. Perhaps I could give her some leftover. No, shouted Jane. Get rid of her. Let me have a look, said Sham. He followed the butler back into the house. He returned a moment later. Darling, you'll never guess who's here. One of your former teachers. Isn't that just the sweetest? Jane screamed. She jumped to her feet. Sprouts flew off her lap and into the hot tub. What's wrong? What's wrong? Asked Sham. You fool, shouted Jane. I told you to get rid of her. She kicked her dog out of the way, then climbed over the railing and jumped off the deck to the ground, 15 feet below. Mrs. Drizzle came out onto the deck. You can't get away from me, young lady, she hollered. Jane hurt her ankle pretty badly when she hit the ground. It was either sprained or broken. She lay on the ground in agony. as she looked up at her former teacher. "You have homework to do," said Mrs. Drizzle, looking down at her. Jane's face twisted up in pain. "Rub a monkey's tummy," she shouted, then struggled to her feet. She had a suitcase stashed in the boathouse, just in case this ever happened. She hobbled to it, grabbed it, then limped down to the lake, dragging her suitcase behind her. Mrs. Drizzle hurried down the steps on the side of the deck. Jane groaned as she threw her suitcase into a motorboat. Then she pulled herself aboard and started the engine. "Darling, come back!" Sham shouted from across the deck as he watched the boat sputter across the water. Mrs. Drizzle climbed into an old rowboat. "I'll find you, Jane Smith," she shouted in the darkness. "You can run, but you can't hide." Jane's voice echoed back across the black water. "Rub a monkey's tummy with your hair!" And neither of them was ever seen again. So Jane Smith, former student, Mrs. Drizzle, really hung up on that homework assignment. Lesson learned: don't miss any homework assignments. I'll find you. Only fooling.